Welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:10 p.m. in a, yes, you guessed it, dark, gray, grim, cold, wet, unpleasant, dank, overcast Budapest, with lights turned on, middle of the afternoon, and it's only September, and it's only mid-September. So that's a foretaste of what's to come. And as you can even hear from my voice, I still haven't been able to shake off my cold, nice early present with the arrival of the cold weather. Anyway, that's that out of the way. Thank you very much, everybody who has joined me, um, and thank you, everybody who's here. And here's a question from Peter Kovic. Um, they always ask about something challenging. See, George, how do you rate Chomsky's work on the Balkans? It's okay. It doesn't. It didn't impress me that much. I mean, I think that he broke with the consensus, but I felt that he conceded far too much ground. So although he made good, strong criticisms of Western interventionism and Western hypocrisy and so on, but he gave away too much. He gave away um, on issues that he shouldn't have given away on, such as Serb atrocities, Serb cruelty. Milosevic is a bad man and everything else. And that there was somehow a humanitarian intervention and so on. So it wasn't that great. But if anyone who was around at that time will remember that it was there were anyone who broke from that consensus were few and far between. There were very, very few people who were prepared to address the issue of what the West did to the Serbs, the cruelty and injustice that was perpetrated against the Serbs, and the basic illegal, unconstitutional, illegitimate destruction, deliberate destruction, malevolent destruction of Yugoslavia, done at the expense of the Serbs, and for which the Serbs were punished, even though they were the victims of that violent, illegal, illegitimate destruction. So Chomsky didn't really get into that, but I think he at least said, "Yeah, I mean, let's not take seriously the West's account of what really happened." Now, Chomsky's erstwhile colleague and writing partner, of course, Edward Herman, it was very different. I think he was very good on the Balkans, and I did some work together with Ed Herman. He published a book on Srebrenica. I contributed an essay to that, and then Herman and I and David Peterson published a long essay on Human Rights Watch and Kosovo, which was quite critical. So Herman, I think, was a different case. I think he was much stronger than Chomsky was on the Balkans. Okay, so anyway, thanks for that question. Now, tomorrow will be the start of President Trump's second state visit to the United Kingdom, and I was thinking today, back in 1982, when Ronald Reagan made his one and only state visit. So Trump has done two state visits. So Reagan did his state visit, and that's when he, that was a historic state visit because he addressed both houses of Parliament. Very unusual. I mean, others leaders. including the horrible Benjamin Netanyahu, have addressed the joint houses of Congress. Or Churchill, of course, addressed the joint house of Congress. But a U.S. president had never addressed both houses of Parliament, and Reagan did. And Reagan delivered his famous ash heap of history speech, where that communism was going to be tossed to the ash heap of history. It made quite an impact at the time. In 1982, the British elite was by no means sold on Reagan. Um, Margaret Thatcher was. She was a huge admirer of Reagan's, but the British political class kind of looked down upon him, didn't trust him, considered him to be not sufficiently Anglo-centric, Eurocentric. He was too much of a cowboy, too much of a Californian, and the speech um, had a mixed reception. Not everybody really thought that it was that great. Um, and back then, you weren't really supposed to talk like that. Just talk about communism and the ash heap of history. That was the way very primitive anti-communists spoke. So that was when Reagan did that. It was kind of surprising. Um, but within a few years, Britain's political elite had come around and now and considered Reagan of their own. But you have to keep in mind that with Reagan, this was in June of 1982, the British were not entirely convinced that Reagan supported them over the Falklands. So when the Argentine generals invaded the Falkland Islands, there was a fear among Britain's ruling classes that Reagan would support Argentina, or at the very least, would profess neutrality as between Argentina and Great Britain, because in April 1982, Argentina was not only an ally of the United States, but was actively involved in the U.S. war um, in Nicaragua, and was supporting the Contras in Nicaragua. I mean, the war against the Sandinistas had already started, of course, under Jimmy Carter, and the Carter administration had brought Argentina in order to and train the Contras. So that actually began under Jimmy Carter, but Reagan continued with it. And but so when the Argentina invaded the Falklands, and given the Reagan administration's commitment to the war in Central America, they were basically they thought, well, uh, Argentina mattered more to them than the British did. And initially within the Reagan administration, there were voices thinking in terms of, well, we got to maintain a certain equidistance from both sides. We can't afford to alienate Argentina, and Peter Kovic says, and Israel too. Yeah, Israel was involved in that. You're absolutely right. Israel was involved in that, and and that went on for a while. If you recall, Alexander, if you recall, it was a long time ago. It's more than 40 years ago, so I don't know what everybody recalls. But during the early days of the following the invasion of the Falkland Islands, Alexander Haig tried to do a kind of Kissinger. Kissinger had been his boss, of course, um, during the Nixon administration. So Kissinger had been national security advisor. Haig had been the deputy national security advisor. But Haig tried to mediate between Britain and Argentina, and he engaged in some shuttle diplomacy between London and Buenos Aires. And to be honest, I mean, he came quite close to a deal that would have prevented the British invasion of the Falklands. I mean, Argentina would have had to withdraw, but they would have received some concessions. But it fell through. I mean, it was one of the Argentine generals are a little like Zelensky. I mean, they got a pretty good deal, but they refused to take it, and so they dragged it out to the end. At that point, the Americans said, "Okay, well, we wash our hands of it, and then Britain can do what it likes and can invade." But Haig had got Thatcher to agree to not to invade the islands, um, and uh, uh, and but it was for a while important to the Americans that Britain and Argentina do not go to war against one another. Um, but I remember then that a lot of these kind of conservative pundits in London, Peregrine Worsthorne was the editor of the Sunday Telegraph. They would come on TV shows and denounce Reagan. They would say somehow that Reagan was not sufficiently, wholeheartedly, full-throatedly supporting the British, and that this was the worst kind of British nightmare, that there would be a president in Washington who would be thinking about other things than keeping the British happy. So he'd be thinking about China, or he'd be thinking about Central America, he'd be thinking about the West Coast. He's not thinking what he's supposed to be thinking about permanently, what every American president is supposed to be thinking about all the time, which is Britain, Europe, that all the NATO. That's all that matters. And the idea that there's be a president who's got other things on his mind than the Atlantic Alliance. But um, in the end, the Americans, as I say, washed their hands of Argentina, and essentially let the British have their way to defeat the Argentine generals, and that was the end of that. Um, but as I say, going back to the speech um, before the both houses of parliament, it was kind of sweet. That an American president starts talking about the ash heap of history, which is, after all, a phrase used by Trotsky. It was Trotsky who had said that about the Mensheviks, and of course, Reagan knew the symbolism of that expression. So anyway, that's tomorrow, and but you have to then say that the Trump has a kind of he throws his weight around, yeah, but it's a very much a diminished presidency, because has not shown himself to have the strength to impose his will on purported allies. So we talk about Ukraine and Russia and so on. Mikey says the U.S. saw the Falklands War as a British Empire imperialist war, no appetite to support it. No, that's not correct. That's absolutely not correct. The initial, as I say, the initial U.S. response was, we don't want two allies, the British and the Argentines, going to war against one another. We need Argentina for our war in Central America, and we need the British, because let's keep in mind, in 1982, there was still the whole issue of the deployment of the Euro missiles, and the anti-nuclear movement was very strong in Britain and in Europe, and so this was a very big deal for Washington to get those Euro missiles deployed. and in the face of huge anti-nuclear protests in Britain and in Europe. So they needed Thatcher for that. So they needed Thatcher's help for that. Um, and they needed Galtieri, General Galtieri of Argentina, his help in Central America. So the Americans tried to mediate between the British and the Argentinians, but in the end, they decided to support Argentina. I mean, sorry, they supported the British because ultimately NATO was the main priority. But for a while, this went on. There was a lot of, the Americans were mediating and trying to resolve this issue because they wanted both. But yeah, I mean, eventually, Washington decided London was more important to us than Buenos Aires is. So and so that's right. But the U.S. There was first of all, the U.S. provided all sorts of intelligence support. That there was a great deal of intelligence, satellite information that the United States provided for the British as they planned their invasion. They sent a task force down to the southern Atlantic, and the Americans were providing intelligence to the task force. So they did that. They didn't provide direct military support, but there was never any question of the British didn't need direct military support to take care of Argentina. What they wanted from the United States was diplomatic support, which they got, and intelligence support, which they got. So the British got everything that they wanted from Argentina, and but they had to go along for a while with the shuttle diplomacy. They had to go along but the Americans said, humor us. We want to try and resolve this peacefully because, hey, Argentina, Britain are both are allies of both of us, and we don't want to. But in the end, I mean, of course, because of the breakdown of the shuttle diplomacy, the Americans threw their weight behind the British. And of course, there were all these UN Security Council resolutions, and the UN Security Council resolutions were wholly in favor of the British, and the Americans supported the resolutions wholly in favor of the British. Um, yeah, that's. But the problem with Trump was, Alistair says they need cruise missiles of Greenham Common. Yeah, that was it. It was Greenham Common. That was that. I mean, Greenham Common. That was a very big deal. But Thatcher was really the key to unlock the whole Euro missiles thing because she was a very strong supporter of the deployment of the Euro missiles, and Thatcher was close to Reagan. So so they needed her. I mean, Helmut Kohl. I mean, see, June 1982. This is when it was all unraveling. I mean, so that was when Reagan made his state visit. So June 1982, Germany. No one knew exactly how Germany was going to go because the Social Democrats were still in power, and while Helmut Schmidt was certainly in favor of the deployment of the Euro missiles, the left of the Social Democrats was strongly against it, and so it was very, very questionable how Germany was going to go. Whether Germany would hold firm on the deployment of the missiles. And in fact, there was a change of government in Germany, but that was later. That was, I think, September of 1982, when basically the Free Democrats abandoned the Social Democrats, and the Free Democrats joined forces with Helmut Kohl's Christian Democrats, and then Germany was on board, and there wasn't any longer any question about the deployment of the Euro missiles. But June '82, it was still up in the air as to whether it was going to happen. Um, Yeah, so that was when Reagan did that. But what's so striking is that here we have the United States, um, which is being treated openly with contempt by Israel. Let's remember that Reagan um, had he took a much harder line on Israel than Trump has done. So in fact, uh, Reagan grew very unhappy after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the siege of Beirut, and he's watching the television and seeing this horror of the siege. But instead of what happened in 1982 in Lebanon was nothing in comparison to what's going on in Gaza. I mean, the Gaza thing is just in a world of its own. And so Reagan was watching this and said, I'm not going to tolerate this. And he got on the phone to Begin and told him to knock it off. And Begin did knock it off for a while. But then in I think September, I think 82, and Reagan actually came up with a peace plan, the Reagan peace plan for the Middle East, which it wasn't quite a two-state solution, but it was at least something for the Palestinians. And it was that the Palestinians would have a state that would be essentially a Jordanian state. So it would be a kind of Jordan Palestine joint state. Wasn't really going to work, but at least it was something. I mean, it was he presented Israel, of course, as always, showed its utter contempt for Reagan's peace plan, and did what Israel has always done, which was to sabotage it, made sure nothing came of the Reagan peace plan. Um, and But what we had now is quite a remarkable. Mikey says Weinberger was quite a sound influence in the Reagan cabinet. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Weinberger, and who did have a kind of was himself had a Jewish background, but Weinberger was actually among the most critical of Israel within the Reagan circle. And particularly when it came to the issue of Jonathan Pollard, he was the one who was the firmest on that. Absolutely no deals at all on Jonathan Pollard. Um, um, uh, uh, Robert says Max Blumenthal seems to think that Trump is genuinely concerned that pushing back too hard against Israel could be hazardous for his health. Yes, I saw that, and it's very interesting that Blumenthal said this. He said that if you're an American president and if you once you've seen what Israel is capable of and what Israel is willing to do, then absolutely. Why wouldn't you think that Israel would go after you if you displease Israel? And so he gave these examples, which are fairly. They said that Blumenthal said something like Trump's security services. They found devices. I think Israelis had left some devices. No, I'm not sure exactly. Was it in the cars or somewhere in the White House? They left devices. But Boris Johnson said in his memoirs that Netanyahu left some kind of a surveillance device in his Johnson's toilet. So, I mean, if they're willing to do that to their allies, they leave some sort of device. Why? Absolutely. Why wouldn't they think in terms of eliminating anyone who stood in their way? So, I do think that if you're an American president You have to think about. Uh, I mean, look, given what the Israelis did with those pages, why wouldn't the Israelis have even more sophisticated devices to think about? Hey, look, anything can happen. A car backfiring. Whatever, or something or other. You got a mysterious illness, and then you waste away very quickly, and lo and behold, you're dead. And well, yeah, I mean, why wouldn't you? I mean, I mean, Trump is what, 79 years old. No one would think it's particularly odd if suddenly Trump got very sick tomorrow. Doctors come and they examine him. They can't find anything, and then boom, he just dies. It's just like that. Which is, of course, what happened in the case of Yasser Arafat. Suddenly, mysteriously, he started getting iller and iller and iller, and then boom, he just died. Yeah, absolutely. I think that you have to have that as a concern. But so what we had last week, if you recall, we had the Israeli attack on Qatar, while Hamas leaders were meeting in Doha to discuss Trump's peace plan. It wasn't really much of a peace plan. I mean, they had already said it looks like something that was drafted by Tel Aviv, and of course, it was drafted by Tel Aviv. But nonetheless, they were there discussing it, um, and and then lo and behold, they come under attack. This is Trump's own peace plan. Now, Trump then went into his denial mode, but of course, none of that was entirely plausible for the obvious reason that Israel's a long way from Qatar. So Israel puts 10 aircraft into the air, and then they fly to Qatar. The United States doesn't pick up this unusual flight path. The Israelis enter Qatar airspace, even though there's a big air military base in Qatar. The United States doesn't pick this up, doesn't do anything to stop the Israeli military aircraft, and they call Washington to say, well, Israel seems about to launch an attack. And then Trump apparently hears about this, and he gets on to he gets onto Steve Witkoff, tells him that Israel is about to launch an attack, and then Witkoff gets onto the Qataris and say, Israel is about to launch an attack, to which the Qataris say, yeah, they've already bloody well launched it. It's a bit bloody late now. Now, there's a real problem here for the United States, which is what why it's so particularly humiliating for the United States, because it's one thing for Israel to pull shit like this when it came to Iran, because they knew essentially that the United States would join forces in this attack on Iran. But Qatar is supposed to be a friend and an ally and a strategic partner of the United States. Trump had visited Qatar earlier in the summer, one of the three Gulf states that he visited, and Qatar had gifted him with with a nice jumbo jet to be your new Air Force One. So attacking Hamas leaders in Qatar is particularly obnoxious. And just saying, that was, we didn't really target the Qatari leaders, we just targeted the Hamas leaders. Well, it's particularly obnoxious because it says, well, we provided them with a refuge here so that diplomacy can take place. So, you wanted us to do it so that they would have an office here so that there could still be diplomacy, there could still be negotiations. We weren't providing them with any kind of succor. We were providing them with an office so that they could act as negotiators, and we Qataris could act as mediators. So when you attack Doha, you kind of make us look quite ridiculous. Now, Trump then, of course, said, yeah, well, they're not going to do this again. Israelis aren't going to do this again. But then you get to the point that Israel says, yeah, we are going to do this again. So yesterday, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was visiting Israel, and and then this and then this is what happened during their joint news conference with Netanyahu and Marco Rubio. So Netanyahu was asked about, well, are you going to attack Qatar again? So here's Netanyahu.
Mr. Prime Minister Robbie Grammer with the Wall Street Journal. Just to put a finer point on it, would you rule out further strikes on Hamas operatives in foreign sovereign countries in the region? And for Secretary Rubio, what's your message to close U.S. allies like the UK, which you plan to visit, on the vote at the United Nations to advance a Palestinian state, not just to nations overall, but some of our closest allies like the UK? Thanks.
The principle that terrorists should not have immunity wherever they are, wherever they may be, was not established by me. We had a massacre a few decades ago. It's called the Munich Massacre, in which PLO terrorists murdered our athletes to the Olympic Games. And my predecessor, Golda Meir, vowed that we shall track down these terrorists and get them one by one, which is what we proceeded to do.
All right. Now, so here he is. Now, this is very interesting. He brings up the Munich Massacre of 1972, which is now 53 years ago. That's a long time ago. And he said, well, Golda Meir vowed to track down all of the people who perpetrated the Munich Massacre. Now, anyone who watched the film Munich, a Steven Spielberg film, will recall correctly, because the film was actually quite accurate, that almost everybody that Israel tracked down and killed had nothing whatever to do with the Munich Massacre. Nothing. I mean, they just went around, in different cities, they just killed some Palestinian. I said, oh yeah, he was involved in the Munich Massacre. I mean, they didn't get a single person who had anything to do with the Munich Massacre. But it didn't really matter, because as far as Israel is concerned, if you kill any Palestinian anywhere, you are somehow contributing to the greater good of Israel, and you are hurting the Palestinian cause. So if you say, well, this guy is just simply a Palestinian journalist, he happens to be living in Paris, he has nothing whatever to do with the Munich Massacre, well, it doesn't really matter, because he's a Palestinian guy, he's living in Paris, he's making trouble for Israel, he's writing all sorts of things that we don't like. He's having all sorts of bad influence on others, poisoning the minds of people against Israel. So we killed him. What's wrong with that? I mean, that's the. But and then of course they can always say, yeah, he was involved in the Munich Massacre, and he got what was coming to him. It's was it in? Just thinking about you remember in Julius Caesar when there's this mob, a rioting mob, and and they grab some guy, Sinner. Yeah, yeah, Sinner. That's the guy. We want to, we need to kill this guy, Sinner. And he says, "Yeah, but I'm Sinner the poet." And then somebody in the mob says, "Well, tear him for his bad verse." And boom, they kill him. Okay, his name is Sinner. But I'm Sinner the poet. Tear him for his bad verse. So that's that. That's the Israeli attitude. Okay, I don't care whether he was involved in the Munich massacre. I mean, he's a Palestinian, so we'll kill him. Even the Munich massacre thing is very dubious. I mean, obviously they seized the athletes and it was a terrorist act, but as to who actually killed the athletes is much murkier than that. I mean, it's really quite a I mean, it was a really botched rescue operation. The absolutely incompetent, useless German police in action. They just started shooting randomly and managed to kill everybody on the way. Anyway, let's go back to and enjoy the extraordinary, excruciating pleasure of listening to Netanyahu. Um,
in the leading European countries. And we did this one by one by one. I didn't hear a great cry of wrongdoing to these countries, even though they weren't harboring terrorists. The terrorists were there. Okay, they didn't even harbor them, as is the case in other cases. The terrorists happened to be on that soil, and we acted, which is what democracies do, including the leading democracy, when they have the ability to target terrorists.
so he's saying here, this is what democracies do. Apparently, they just go to other countries and just start killing people. They don't bother with extradition. They don't bother to notify the authorities of the sovereign country. Like, you have a terrorist living there. We want him. Could you arrest him? And then we can move towards extraditing him. No, we just go and we just kill them. And not only do we kill them, we don't even bother to notify you or the due authorities that we intend to do this. We just go ahead and do it. And that's this is and he says this is what democracies do. I did not know that. I've never heard of that. The democracies. I don't remember. Say the British. The British aren't exactly the nicest of people, but they didn't go around killing IRA figures in Dublin. They didn't go sending out assassination squads into Dublin in order to assassinate IRA leaders. But Israel thinks this is perfectly reasonable. And as I say, they didn't get anyone. I mean, they just went around killing completely innocent people and said, "Oh yeah, they were involved in the Munich massacre." So here he is. He's the way this is the way they always justify every kind of terrorist act that they do. Now, it's a very interesting case because um, they sometimes have to watch their step a little bit. So, like in the case of Vanunu, who provided the secrets of Israel's nuclear program. He provided them to, I think it was the Sunday Times in London. And then, of course, the Israeli security authorities found out about it almost immediately. Who exactly tipped them off is murky. I mean, it's always thought that Robert Maxwell tipped them off, but he may have been Rupert Murdoch. I mean, Murdoch's a scumbag, low life, disgusting vermin. So he may well have been the person. He was providing the Murdoch newspapers with the details of Israel's uh, nuclear program, but Murdoch would absolutely tip off the Israelis about this. But in any case, the Israelis wanted to seize Vanunu in London, just grab him right there and then, and just take him straight to Israel. Um, they felt that Thatcher would be unhappy about this, and so essentially they lured Vanunu to Rome. They took him to Rome. What the Israelis do. They set up a honeypot. They're masters of the honey trap. They got Vanunu. They lured him to Rome to go with this Israeli woman, spy. And then once in Rome, they drugged him and then took him to Israel. They felt that they could do this to Israel, to Rome rather. They didn't want to antagonize Thatcher. So sometimes they're careful about whom they insult. I think the Israelis despise the Italians, but it's like, okay, we don't want to antagonize Thatcher. Thatcher would be upset if we kidnapped him on the streets of London. So we'll take him to Rome. We'll kidnap him in Rome. But anyway, let's go back and listen to Netanyahu.
Threaten their civilians. So this is a principle we established. It's a principle we follow. It hasn't changed.
On your question, these things that people are doing and these different countries are doing at the United Nations, first of all, they're largely being done because of their own domestic politics. Second of all, they're largely symbolic. They have really no impact whatsoever in bringing us any closer to a Palestinian state. The only impact they actually have is it makes Hamas feel more emboldened. It makes other elements like Hamas feel more emboldened. It actually has made it harder. It's actually served as an impediment to peace. In the past, we have seen when these statements have come out, maybe there's a negotiation going on. Maybe you think you've actually made some progress on getting some hostages released or an end to the war. And then these things come out, and all of a sudden these groups back off. In many cases, walk away. Hamas has walked away from agreements that they actually had tacitly agreed to. But then they see the sort of international support they believe they're getting and they walk away from it. So we've warned of two things. One, it actually makes it harder to negotiate when those negotiations were occurring, and because it emboldens these groups. And the second is we've warned them that there will be an Israeli counter reaction to those moves, and we've seen some of that happen as well. So I think these things have actually made it harder to end this war and this conflict, not easier. And we've expressed that to them. I've expressed that to them directly.
All right, so there he is. He's saying it's all the fault of the slimy Europeans, Australians, and everyone else for going around recognizing Palestine. Apparently, without that, we'd have peace. Without that, somehow the Israel would be really cooperative and helpful, and it's the Europeans who are in the way of real diplomacy. So that's the kind of nonsense. But what was striking, though, in what Netanyahu said in answer to that question is that, yeah, we're going to go ahead and we will take out Hamas wherever they may be. And said, yeah, we've always done this and we always will do this. Which is very interesting because, of course, Trump had said that there'll be no more attacks on Qatar. Now, since Trump and Rubio said, well, we value Qatar and we value Qatar's role in mediation. Well, the only way Qatar can engage in mediation is if it has Hamas leaders there who can negotiate. But Trump said, "Oh no, they're not going to attack Qatar again." And then Netanyahu said, "Yeah, we'll attack whomever, wherever, whenever we feel like it." Um, anyway, so then Rubio obviously it's such an obvious, blatant contradiction. Netanyahu with utter contempt for the U.S. position, he's just going around saying flagrantly, "No, I mean, the United States isn't going to stop us." So here, Rubio was then asked about this on his way out of Israel and heading towards Doha.
We would all prefer to see a negotiated end that leads to all the hostages being released, that leads to Hamas being disarmed and eliminated as a threat. And we think Qatar can play a very key role in that. So we're going there. We have a close partnership with the Qataris. In fact, we have an enhanced defense cooperation agreement, which we've been working on, and we're on the verge of finalizing. We want them to know how much we appreciate and respect all the time and work and effort they put in the past to these negotiations, and we hope they'll re-engage despite everything that's happened. We know they're upset about it.
Secretary, yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu declined to refuse to carry out further strikes on Hamas operatives. As you know, there's Hamas operating in Turkey, in Egypt, in addition to Qatar. What was your message on further strikes? Was it don't do it again? Was it another message?
Well, I'm not going to discuss the details of everything that we said. That's not the way you can conduct diplomacy or international relations via press conference in that way. But what I would say is this: is what I just said a moment ago. We all prefer that this end with a negotiated settlement that leads to the release of every single hostage, both alive and deceased, that leads to the demilitarization and disarming of Hamas, so they can no longer pose a threat, not just to Israel, but everyone. These are barbarians. These are animals, the Hamas. And that leads us into a process of reconstructing Gaza so the people of Gaza can have a life free of Hamas and a life that's much better than what they've experienced under Hamas. That's what we all prefer. We think Qatar can play a very key role in that. We don't want to see anything that undermines that. So that's why we added it to the trip. They're very, they're close partners. We worked with them on a lot of things. We wanted to stay engaged, despite being upset as they are with what happened last week. And then the president said he wasn't happy to see that happen. But nonetheless, all these problems are still here. They got to be fixed. We can talk about a key role in solving.
The basic complaints of countries in Doha yesterday was that the United States holds a double standard when it comes to Israel, that it's not holding Israel to account for its actions that they see as an escalation, the killing of civilians in Gaza. What will be your message in Doha today to Israel?
Well, look, I mean, the civilians are being used as human shields by Hamas. They've always done it.
And here we go. Everything is always it's Hamas, 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 Hamas. But notice how he doesn't really answer the question. I mean, he was asked the question. Hey, Israel has said that they intend to go on targeting those they deem to be Hamas operatives, Hamas leaders, wherever they are. And they don't care about what you have to say. And then he kind of, blathers on and, to do what U.S. officials continue to do, which is it's all Hamas, 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 which is, of course, what Israel always does, just either Hamas anti-Semitism, Hamas anti-Semitism, it's always the same thing. So Trump was also asked about this. He was asked about it yesterday at the Oval Office. Hey, what are you going to do? That Israel says that they will absolutely target Hamas if necessary in Qatar. And let's see how Trump responded to that.
Netanyahu said that he doesn't rule out targeting Hamas anywhere they are. You said that you don't want to see Qatar hit again. Do you Are there any guarantees that Qatar?
Well, he won't be hitting in Qatar, as I say. I call it Qatar. You call it Qatar. You're actually more right, but actually, you're allowed to go. The Emir said you can say it any way you want, but I've always thought of it as Qatar. I think it's a beautiful sound, and actually, they've been a very good ally. And a lot of people don't know that. But he won't be hitting Qatar, but he will be maybe going after. Now, there was an article that I read in a newspaper just about an hour ago where Hamas said they're going to use the 20 hostages as human shields. They're going to bring them up from the dark tunnels, and they're going to put them in the line of fire so that if Israel goes forward, they're going to die. And I thought that was very terrible, and I put out a statement on that. You saw that.
All right. So this is what Trump did yesterday, because he knew that this Israeli onslaught on Gaza City is about to happen. And Trump, as is his wont, he's very good at this. He's been doing it all his life. Has moved very quickly to change the subject. And so suddenly, he's talking about this thing that Hamas is going to use the hostages as human shields. This is what they're going to do. They're going to use the hostages as human shields. So he just puts this out, the story. The story is, of course, coming from Israel. In other words, hey, let's not talk about this onslaught on Gaza City, and there was about 1 million Palestinians living there. Let's talk about this phony story about using hostages as and human shields. And so Trump is now repeating this, and he did this today as well when he was about to fly off to London, and he was asked several times about, well, what do you think of this offensive against Gaza City? And over again, he said the same thing, but always say the same thing.
Ground offensive is now underway in Gaza City. Your reaction?
So we're going to see what happens because I hear Hamas is trying to use the old human shield deal, and if they do that, they're going to be in big trouble. They're going to be in big trouble. They put it out 2 days ago that they're going to use the hostages as human shield. That's something that hasn't done for a long time, you know. Let me tell you, if they do that, they're in big trouble.
So they're gonna do. So that's it. So, and he was asked several times during this presser about, well, what do you think of this Israeli attack on the Gaza City? And every time he didn't say anything other than to bring up this thing about Hamas, the human shields, and that if Hamas does this, then they're in big trouble. Now, right away, you have to think about, well, what does he mean that they're in big trouble? What exactly is Israel going to do that he hasn't done before? I mean, Israel has pretty much killed off all of Hamas's leaders. I mean, there are no Hamas leaders left. So what does it mean they will be in big trouble? I mean, they've already done that. They haven't won the war, so that's already quite pointless. I mean, it should have been fairly obvious. You can kill off Hamas leaders to your heart's content. That's still not going to end the war for you. And so it says, oh, he does, this is what Trump does. They're going to be big trouble. But it's hard to see if there's anything more that Israel can do that it hasn't already done. But it's striking that how he responds to these questions. So, I don't know, maybe there'll be more questions like this when he's in the UK on his official state visit, and he will respond in exactly the same way this is what he always does. He just simply changes the subject, and lo and behold, he's back to defending Bibi, and so this is this is how he always does this. Um, and So here, let's just take a look here. Here is the truth that let's see. This is the truth that he sent out, and here it says, "I have just read a news report that Hamas has moved the hostages above ground to use them as human shields against Israel's ground offensive. I hope the leaders of Hamas know what they're getting into if they do such a thing. This is a human atrocity, the likes of which few people have ever seen before. Don't let this happen, or all bets are off. Release all hostages now." What are you going to do? And then this is a human atrocity, the likes of which few people have ever seen before. None of this has happened. He's just making this stuff up. He's just made this stuff up, and he's pretending as if this has some reality to it. And here's the source. So he publishes. He linked first to a story in the Telegraph, the London Telegraph, piece of shit newspaper. And here is the link to the Times of Israel. Ahead of Gaza City operation, Hamas moved hostages above ground to restrict army's movements. And here it is. Ahead of Israel's operation to conquer Gaza City, Hamas has moved hostages above ground to homes and tents to restrict the military from operating in certain areas. Palestinian sources in Gaza tell the Khan public broadcaster. And it says here, yesterday, the mother of hostage guy Gilboa Dalal said she was informed that her son is being held above ground in Gaza City after the terror group published a video of him last week in which he was in the back seat of a car above ground. So none of this has any reality. And but it's very important to put this out there, and suddenly, yay, we're changing the subject. And this is always how Israel has operated. And of course, it's how Trump's operate. Now, what is striking about this is just how weak and ineffectual U.S. is towards Israel. Just comparing it to the Reagan era. I mean, we know what Israel has always got more or less a free pass from Washington, but some presidents have taken a harder line on Israel than others. But Reagan, the hero of the neocons, actually was among the presidents who took the hardest line on Israel. He really was unhappy about Israel's invasion of Lebanon. Not only was he unhappy about this, he was unhappy about the deceit that was practiced on him. Because remember, when Israel launched its attack on Lebanon in June 1982, they did it claiming that this was in response to an assassination attempt to Israel's ambassador in London. Now, the Israeli ambassador, nothing happened to him. He survived this assassination attempt, went on to live many, many years. And in any case, the group that was allegedly behind this assassination, allegedly, was Abu Nidal's group, and Abu Nidal was basically working for the Israelis. I mean, it was a fake organization. So Abu Nidal was working for Mossad. So this was the whole idea that the PLO was behind the Israeli ambassador's assassination attempt was ridiculous and a lie. But that's what triggered the officially triggered the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. But of course, an invasion like that takes a lot of preparation. You don't just simply launch an invasion overnight. You've got to get your ducks in a row. And of course, they'd been planning this invasion for a long time, and they were working in collusion with Alexander Haig. Haig was working with the Israeli military. And of course, the goal was to destroy the PLO. I mean, this is standard operating practice with Israel, which is there's always something in the way of a peaceful settlement in the Middle East. Always something. There's Gamal Abdel Nasser, Yasser Arafat, Saddam Hussein, the Iranians, Hamas. There's always something. If only we can get rid of this person. If only we can get rid of Khamenei, Saddam Hussein. Incidentally, there was a time when they were planning on getting rid of the Hashemites. The Hashemites are the problem. They're probably the Hashemites, because the Hashemites are in the way. If only we can get rid of the Hashemites from Jordan, from Amman, then we could make Jordan the Palestinian state. There was a moment when Israel was actually targeting King Hussein of Jordan, this really, ineffectual pro-Western leader. But so he was in the way of a settlement in the Middle East. But so that was the moment. Now the point is that Reagan really didn't appreciate this. He didn't appreciate being made to look a fool, because he didn't know that Israel was about to launch this invasion of Lebanon, and that it had all been planned in advance, and that Israel was putting out this stupid story that this was in response to the assassination attempt on Israel's ambassador in London, and that Al Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State, was in on this. And of course, that led to the downfall of Alexander Haig. And Haig then wrote his memoirs, purporting to be surprised as to why he had been fired. So why was I fired? I don't get it. It was all a plot. You remember he wrote an entire book about this plot to get him, and he blamed Baker, Meese, Diva. They were the sort of the people who were in the White House out to get Haig. But the point is, anyway, once they did that, and they as is Israel's wont, they occupied Lebanon and treated the Palestinians, obviously, but also the Lebanese, with extraordinary brutality and cruelty. And then, of course, they having given their word. Remember, they gave their word. We're dealing with true scumbags. They are disgusting people. These Israelis. They gave their word to the Americans. They say, "Oh well, we will allow the PLO fighters to leave. If you come in, the U.S. Marines can come in and help them leave." So the U.S. Marines came in, and they did help the PLO leave Lebanon. But there was a caveat there, which was, okay, the PLO, they're leaving Lebanon, but they're leaving their families behind, and so they expect Israel not to touch the women and children. Well, that's always the stupidest thing you can ever assume, that Israel isn't going to touch the women and children, because the moment the PLO fighters were out of Lebanon, then Israel got their allies, which was the Maronite militia, to go into the Palestinian camps looking for terrorists, and of course they slaughtered hundreds, thousands of women and children. They were right in front of the Americans. So the Americans were made to look, truly disgusting because they just actually taken part in this massacre of women and children. I mean, they had facilitated the withdrawal of the PLO fighters, and they just allowed this massacre to take place. And the disgusting Israelis then said, "Well, it wasn't us. We didn't do it. It was why are you blaming us? It was the Maronites. It was the Maronite militia. They did it. That was it was Bashar Gemayel. It was his people who did it. This is so unfair. This is anti-Semitic to blame us, even though they did. It was they were sent in to the camps by the Israeli military. The Israeli military provided all the intelligence, provided the lighting and everything else, so they could do their massacres. So anyway, but Reagan didn't appreciate that either. So Sabra and Shatila essentially was facilitated by the Americans. I mean, the reason I bring this up is that he's this hero of the neoconservatives, and Reagan really didn't think much of the neoconservatives, particularly when it came to Israel. But in comparison with Trump, Reagan was much firmer with Israel. He actually, I mean, as I say, he actually got on the phone to Menachem Begin and told him to end the siege of Beirut. He didn't do what Trump does, which is just to basically sign off on Israeli attacks on whoever, Israeli attack on Iran or Israeli attack on Gaza City, and then somehow do his usual thing of a distraction by picking up some story out of nowhere from saying, oh well, Hamas is going to use some hostages as human shields. So anyway, let's take a look before we go on. Let's take a look at our commenters on our locals page. These are the generous helpers, the people who help the make sure that the dogs are fed. The dogs are kept happy. Because the dogs are wont to check the tip jar, and invariably they are dissatisfied with the condition of the tip jar, and then what always happens is that they blame me. That so why is the tip jar in this lamentable condition? Obviously, you're failing in your tasks, and I don't really have too much of a a good argument against that. So thank you everybody who contributes to the tip jar and keeps this the gaggle going. Anyway, Summer Petrus, good to see you, Summer Petrus. Hope you're coming back to Hungary soon. And Summer Petrus says, "Dear George and fellow Gagglers, today I spent a good few hours watching the debate in the UK Parliament on Lord Mandelson and his appointment as ambassador in Washington. Not many people will have a whole debate centered on themselves, but this is something Lord Mandelson has managed to achieve for himself. I listened until the leader of the Lib Democrat Party rose to speak, which obviously was a signal to put the kettle on. And what struck me was that prominent among his detractors were members of the War Party in Parliament. Lord Mandelson's PR firm often acted for Chinese and Russian companies trying to secure mutually beneficial deals with the West. Could it be that this was the reason President Trump reportedly got on well with the UK ambassador, unlike with many of his forebears? I think that's quite likely. You're absolutely right. Mandelson was an utter sleazeball. He was a very slick person, very smart. He kind of created Tony Blair. He saw the opportunity with New Labor, and the guy who was before Blair, John Smith, he didn't particularly like Mandelson. He didn't have much of a role with John Smith. But then when Blair and Brown took over the Labor Party, this was the heyday for Mandelson. So he kind of invented New Labor and the whole Cool Britannia thing, which that was completely ridiculous. If you recall the days of the late 90s, somehow, hey, we're back to the sort of swinging London, the swinging 60s and so on, under Blair. So Blair became a kind of reincarnation of the new spirit of London. But all of that was really an invention of Mandelson's. Now, the problem was that Mandelson himself was really quite a scandalous figure. So, uh, he first had to resign after he got an interest-free loan from a member of the government. It was a member of the cabinet. The problem with that interest-free loan was that Mandelson's own board of trade was investigating the government minister's business interests. So there was a little bit of a conflict of interests there, and Mandelson obviously had to resign because it was quite ridiculous for him to be accepting interest-free loans from somebody who was supposed to be overseeing. Um, and then Mandelson came back, and in no time at all, Mandelson got himself into another scandal. This time over citizenship applications. So there was, again, somebody with big business interests, somebody who had contributed to the Labour Party, to Tony Blair's Millennium Project, some sleazy Indian businessman, and having contributed a lot of money, this guy was said, well, I need something in return. I want a fast, expedited citizenship application, and Mandelson went up ahead and uh, provided an expedited citizenship process. Well, of course, obviously, you can't go around doing that. And then Mandelson had to resign again. I mean, the citizen applications are supposed to be serious, judicious matters. You have to go through the legal process. You can't just simply say, "Hey, this guy is a friend of mine. He's donated a lot of money to the Labour Party, donated a lot of money to the Millennium Project. Give the man his citizenship already." But I think that's how Mandelson kind of sees the world. I mean, I think he's totally a means end. He has really very little ethical concerns. It's just, hey, this is the way business is done. Um, so that was that. But of course, then after his second resignation from the government, he went on to make a lot of money, and as you say, he had these links with China. Look, if you're somebody like Mandelson, of course you make yourself available to the Chinese. I mean, we know what China does. We know this is how they operate. They buy people, they buy access, they buy influence. They buy universities. That's what they do. And somebody like Mandelson is absolutely on their radar for somebody who can be bought and who can actually deliver things for China. And actually, he took money from China. He took money from various Russians as well. He became quite close to Oleg Deripaska. Yeah, of course, he got very rich. That's who he is. He's somebody who greases the wheels for rich, influential people, and the Chinese would absolutely want somebody batting for them. Mandelson, no hesitation with that. Now, the case of Epstein was, of course, very interesting because, of course, he and Epstein are very similar. They're more or less the same person. Absolute slime balls, very much sucking up to rich, powerful people, making a lot of money along the way, making themselves useful for rich, powerful people, and naturally they became close friends. Uh, that's how they operate. I mean, I don't know. You've probably seen the photographs of him of Mandelson and Epstein together. Mandelson seems to be wearing a bathrobe, and it's kind of looked pretty sleazy, to be honest. I mean, just kind of the whole dynamic in that photograph with Epstein in that bathrobe. Um, but naturally they were friend. He was friends. Now, so why did um, Starmer appoint uh, Mandelson? Well, I think he probably thought that I think, as you say, that Mandelson would get on well with Trump because Mandelson has that kind of oily, um, ingratiating charm that would appeal to Trump. I think that was very smart of Starmer to think, yeah, Mandelson, who likes money, always liked money, always liked business deals, doesn't really believe anything very much, other than advancing his cause and making lots of money along the way. He would get on very well with Trump. And he did get on very well with Trump. They hit it off very, very well. Not only that, Mandelson went around giving speeches expressing his admiration for Trump and how Trump, has understood the nature of the world. He's understood the move against globalization. He's understood the threat from multinational corporations. He understood how people are losing out from globalization. So Mandelson has now realized, I mean, this is a guy who was Mr. Globalization himself. So say, if one thinks of globalization, the heyday of globalization, of let's end national borders, let's end all these fuddy-duddy parochial nation states, and we'll just have these international institutions. That was Blairism. That's what Blairism was about, and Mandelson was the prophet of that. He was he was the prophet of Blairism. And now here is Mandelson going around giving these speeches in which he says, well, yeah, I mean, there's a real move against uh, globalization, and Trump really is, the leader of the anti-globalization movement. Now we have to understand why there is this move against globalization. We have to understand the populist anger. Mandelson's about as far from populism as you can imagine, but we have to somehow acknowledge the populist anger. So yeah, he absolutely gone on well with Trump. So Starmer was smart in making that appointment. I to be I don't obviously I can't stand Starmer, but you have to think that when he made that appointment, which was I guess February of this year, uh, Starmer really didn't think that the Epstein thing would be any kind of a big issue. I mean, it was like it's over and done with. Why would he think that anybody would, that this was going to come up? It was just ancient history. Um, so I can understand why he didn't think this would be a big problem. And so he said, yeah, I think he's going to be someone who will get on well with Trump. So the previous ambassadors got on very poorly with Trump, particularly during the Trump's first term. There was that awful ambassador, forgotten his name, Darren, somebody. I think you probably remember this. Um, and he was sending out these messages talking about how he couldn't stand Trump. It was all chaotic and it was a total mess. It was a shit show in the White House, and so the Daily Mail, I think, got hold of these messages. This is what the British ambassador was saying about Trump, and so obviously he had to resign, and Boris Johnson had to kind of do a mea culpa, about this. But Johnson was foreign secretary at the time, so they had to appoint someone else. But that was the view then about Trump. They thought Trump was a kind of a passing phenomenon, and that he would just be gone soon enough. Now things, now obviously things are a little different. Um, but as I say, I don't think. I mean, if you're Starmer and you in February, um, you're trying to keep Trump happy. You think, well, Mandelson's are probably a pretty good bet. Then they will actually get on rather well, and they did get on very well. Trump did his usual thing. He said to Mandelson, "I really like your accent." He does this. I really like your accent. And so, uh, but the Epstein thing just really almost came out of nowhere. I don't think anybody was really expecting the sudden explosion of Epstein, um, and which only really came about because of Pam Bondi's had bungling of the whole thing. I mean, first of all, saying, "Yeah, we've got the list. We're gonna publish the Epstein list. We're gonna, get all this information out," and suddenly you whipped up this excitement, and then she turned around and said, "Well, there's nothing to publish. There's no information. He committed suicide. There was no list. End of story. Let's all forget about it and move on to something else." I mean, it was such a total disaster that suddenly the Epstein thing blew up, and then, of course, once it blew up, then Mandelson was going to be swept under it. Now, I mean, what was, I guess, once that happened, Starmer was in a bind, but you have to feel sympathy. I mean, once it broke out into the open, and I think Mandelson had warned Starmer that there may be some embarrassing emails that are going to come out. Starmer had continued to support him until these embarrassing emails did come out, and and I have to then say that I mean, what Mandelson said in those emails, well, was not so terrible. I remember this was really about 2008, 2009, long before the Me Too movement, long before the whole all women must be believed. Um, I think it was reasonable to think, he's being unfairly railroaded. And, this whole thing, you know, has the air of a witch hunt about it. Maybe that, he went too far, but that's who Mandelson was. Mandelson's a kind of he's an ingratiating sort of person. I mean, he wanted to keep in with Jeffrey Epstein. And what do you do, Jeffrey, when a friend of yours has legal problems? You send him emails and say, "Well, I have real sympathy for you. You're being railroaded. It's really unfair. Um, Nothing like that would happen if you were living in Britain," which incidentally is true, because the age of consent in Britain is much lower than the age of consent in Florida. So the legal problems that Jeffrey Epstein ran into in Florida, he wouldn't have run into, certainly not in Britain, but certainly he would not have run into in most of Europe, where age of consent is 14 or at most 15. But Florida had a very high age of consent. It was 18, which is very, very high, and that is what gave, put Epstein to legal jeopardy. So you can understand. You're talking to a friend, and you want to help your friend out. You say, you know, I'm sorry that you're in this legal bind, and so I don't know, but that's who Mandelson is. So I don't. I'm not a huge fan of Mandelson's, but I don't think he did anything so terrible. He was in the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that. But I mean, yeah, I can just imagine, a parliament having this ridiculous debate. I mean, the British politicians are at their worst when they just start going on, and they think this is a freebie. It's a freebie because first of all they can bash Mandelson, who's a has-been. I mean, he doesn't have a political future, um, and they can obviously bash the government. That's fun because Starmer has record unpopularity, and then they can vent on the horrors of child exploitation, the horrors of child grooming, the horrors of child sex trafficking. It's such an easy one. Which politician isn't going to try and hit it out of the ballpark? And then they can blame Mandelson for all of that, even though Mandelson had nothing to do with any of that. Anyway, so I kind of ended up defending Mandelson, which I don't really want to do, but I think in this case, but in terms of Chinese and Russians, of course, he goes where the money is. He just sniffs out money, and money, of course, sniffs him out. Anyway, thank you so much, Salma Petros. Thank you for your generosity. Dr. Nostrand, I haven't seen you in a while, so Dr. Nostrand. The Monroe Doctrine would seem to require the U.S. To side with Argentina. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And because I do remember that time, and in those very early days, just after Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, there was indeed a great deal of um, speculation that the United States would side with Argentina. That's basically that. Why Argentina was something they needed now. They were crucial in fighting communism. Everyone was preoccupied with fighting communism in Central America at that time, and these were rubbishy islands. I mean, who needs these islands? I mean, they didn't have any real um, geopolitical significance. There was nothing. There was no strategic interest in holding on to these islands. There was no mineral resources, no wealth there. Why would they? If Argentina wants them, to give them to Argentina. I mean, I think so. That's why people thought that's going to be the attitude of the Reagan administration. Say, look, that's all the Argentines want. They just want these damn islands. What do the British need them for? No, they're nowhere near, nowhere near Britain. So I mean, so I think that was the original. I think many people in Britain thought that the Americans would side with Argentina, and as I say, for quite a while, the Americans were trying to broker some kind of a deal before finally the Americans threw their weight behind Thatcher. But I agree. The Monroe Doctrine would require that the U.S. side with Argentina. Um, and then Robert, good to see you, Robert, and And so Robert says Ritter thinks Turkish intelligence could have picked up on the plan, instructed the representatives of Hamas to leave their phones in the meeting room and get the hell out of Dodge. Um, I have heard that. Not about the Turkish aspect, but the whole issue of the phones. That was the reason why they were saved, because they didn't keep the phones um, in their pockets. They placed the phone somewhere else. Could be. I don't know. I mean, how for once um, Hamas was able to avoid getting hit by the Israelis. I mean, so somebody or other um, had tipped them off. Now, I that's an interesting theory. I am skeptical. I mean, now that you mention it, it is interesting, um, because that does sound like somebody tipped off Hamas about this impending attack. Because it's I mean, everybody up until now, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iranians had been sitting ducks for these Israeli attacks. So suddenly having this ruse of putting the phones in another room, it sounds like somebody had tipped off Hamas. Um, well, maybe that was maybe the Americans had done it. I have my doubts about the Turkish intelligence. I don't know, just I don't. I'm not buying the Turkish aspect of it, but it's possible that the Americans had done this. Um, and indeed Trump may have heard about this and then given them notice because he didn't want them killed. Um, so yeah, I think that's quite plausible, because it's the first time that Hamas has managed to to avoid being a sitting duck. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. Cynthia, always very good to see you. Cynthia, as I always say, we had a great film screened last night, which was La Ventura, which is kind of one of the great masterpieces of European cinema, um, by Michelangelo Antonioni. It's not a film for everyone. I mean, it's slow, it's quite long, not a great deal happens, but you've got to get into the whole the dynamic, so to speak. There isn't much dynamism. The dynamic of Antonioni's film craft to appreciate what he's doing there. I mean, it's he's not telling a story in any traditional way. It's a lot of his artistic composition, mood, and using scenery to create states of mind, to convey states of minds and moods of characters through, uh, photographing scenery. So you have to really appreciate, that kind of film craft. Anyway, we had that La Ventura yeah, screened yesterday, so it's there on our locals board. Enjoy it. It's free. If you're a member, it's free. You can just watch it. You can download it. You can have it, so you'll keep it your own hard drive with subtitles. Get to keep the subtitles, and of course, what's important is you read Cynthia's commentary, her observations, the background information that she provides. So much really interesting backstory to the making of La Ventura. So I think it's a great treat, and it's one of the great perks of being a member of the Gaggle locals community. So watch the film, enjoy it. It's not Hollywood, so you've got to put all that behind you. But it's once you appreciate, the Antonioni's film craft, that I think you really get to see a very different way of telling a story through cinema. But as you do that, please read Cynthia's really interesting commentary. Anyway, Cynthia says here, the twists and turns leading to Kirk's death run almost perfectly parallel to the twists and turns of countless U.S. administrations in their endless wars. So it's tempting to speculate that the very foundations of the country are replete with twists and turns, with egregious consequences for their victims, save for the latter day Zionist factor in their manipulating and controlling successive presidents and their administrations. Well, I think that's very interesting, and it really quite interesting that how we're having difficulties um, getting a handle on what really happened with Charlie Kirk. Now, obviously, something is being played. We're being played now because we're moving towards the lone assassin uh, theory. I mean, it's going to be the lone assassin. It's clear even as today, as they were reading out the indictment on, Tyler Robinson, that they're presenting this as a case of the lone assassin. He didn't have any accomplices, and and the motive seems, it's sort of political, but also personal. So once we read this and say, oh yeah, well, he was just become crazy and whatever because he got in with some bad people, or the room with his roommate and so on. It's clear that we're not going to get much further with this. The story is now set in stone that he's a lone assassin. I'm not buying that for 1 minute. I'm really not. I think that he was involved in these various chat groups. He communicated very volubly and vigorously with the fellow members of his chat groups, and he seems to belong to several chat groups. He seems to have told them quite early on, in fact, really within hours, that he had done this, and it doesn't sound as if it was anyone in the chat group who had denounced him to the authorities. Now, that always is very, very strange, and I'm not going to say that I know what happened, or that there was a conspiracy or whatever. But even just from the story that is being put out now, the lone assassin theory isn't working. It just doesn't really make a great deal of sense. But it's when I say that they're going with that story, in that I don't think they're going to prosecute anyone else. I don't think this. They want to bring anybody else into this. And then now, it's true that we never know exactly about, when it comes to the U.S. government. Even just let's look at the recent past, the very recent past, which is just what happened in June of this year, which was the U.S.-Israel attack on Iran. Now, maybe when you read the New York Times, the official story, they tell us one version. They tell us, no. The story is Israel launched this attack, and then the United States decided to join in. Now, that's a very different story from what is, I think, was much more likely to have happened, which was that the United States and Israel planned the thing together. It was a joint operation, carefully planned, carefully lured Iran into a negotiating posture, deceived Iran, um, uh, dece- deceived Iran into letting its guard down, and then deceived Iran in attacking it just on the eve of the next round of negotiations. But that's not the official story. You read the New York Times. The New York Times, no, no, no. The United States did not want this attack. Israel went ahead and did it. And then Trump, at some point, for reasons that are not clear, decided that he was going to join in with this Israel attack. That's a very different story from I think what's much more likely to have happened. But that's, you see, the why does the New York Times go along with a particular version, which because you have to present the United States as this bumbling giant who decides, well, maybe we need to help Israel out. Gosh, we don't really want to get involved. We don't want to just attack um, much smaller, weaker powers and deceive them. Pretend that we're negotiating, and then we just deceive them into letting their guard down, and then we hit them, because that's really nasty. That's treacherous. I mean, if you invite someone to come and negotiate with you at your home, and then you ambush them at your home, that's really bad. That's the worst thing you can do. So instead of going with that story, then we'll go with which a much more benign story. Well, we had to help Israel out because Israel needed our help. Israel didn't have the means at its disposal to take care of Iran by itself. So that's that story. Something similar is happening now in the case of um, what happened with Doha. What did they go together with? Was this United States and Israel colluding in order to kill Hamas leaders? Um, we don't know. There's a lot of deceit going on. The United States is saying, Trump administration is saying, we had nothing to do with any of this. We were caught by surprise. Israel did it by itself, and really we didn't get any um, heads up before the attack. That's the official line. That's the administration is peddling this line. New York Times repeats exactly the same line. Netanyahu says in public, "Yeah, yeah, we made that decision. No one else had any role in this decision. We made that decision, so it's entirely our decision." And then the Israeli media says something different. Israeli media says, "No, no, 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 no. Israel and the United States were working hand in hand to hit the, the, the the leaders of Hamas." So, for instance, let's take a look. Here's a story from Axios. This is Axios. Um, all right, this is Axios. Let me just pull this up and so we can see the story. And so here's Axios. Scoop. Netanyahu spoke to Trump before Israel bombed Qatar. So that's the story that's put out by Axios. Now let's remember, Axios, this guy Barak Ravid, he's essentially used as a conduit by Israeli intelligence. That's his function. He's not really a journalist. He's a conduit. He's a mouthpiece of Israeli intelligence. And here it says Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu informed President Trump last Tuesday morning that Israel planned to attack Hamas leaders in Qatar shortly before the strike took place. So that's the story. This is coming from Israel. So Israel is essentially telling the United States, you're not going to go around claiming that this had nothing to do with you. So even though Netanyahu says in public, yeah, absolutely, it had nothing to do with anyone except us. We in Israel, we made that decision. No one else but us made that decision. Trump said, yeah, I knew nothing about this. It had nothing to do with me. But Israeli intelligence saying, no, you aren't going to walk away from this, pretending that you had nothing to do with it. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu informed President Trump last Tuesday morning that Israel planned to attack Hamas leaders in Qatar shortly before the strike took place. The White House has claimed it was notified only after missiles were in the air, giving Trump no opportunity to oppose the strike. And then says seven Israeli officials tell Axios the White House knew earlier, even if the timeline to stop it would have been tight. Asked Tuesday evening whether he was notified in advance by Israel, Trump claimed he was not, as he's been claiming all along. He has publicly expressed disapproval over the attack because Qatar is a key U.S. ally. And then Trump again denied prior knowledge after the story published, claiming he found out about the attack when the public did. The version of events U.S. officials laid out last week was that the U.S. military saw Israeli jets, blah, blah, which we talked about earlier. And then the White House said Witkoff rushed to warn the Qataris. And then it says, bombing a U.S. ally without consulting Washington would be an incredibly audacious move by Israel, particularly since the Hamas leadership had been gathering to discuss Trump's latest Gaza peace proposal. So in other words, what he's saying here is, yeah, you're going to believe that a U.S. ally was attacked and Israel did not even consult Washington? You're going to believe that? According to the Israeli officials, Netanyahu did inform the White House very late in the game, but it was early enough that the strike could have been called off. That's it. It was early enough that the strike still could have been called off. 3 Israeli officials told Axios Netanyahu called Trump about the impending strike around 8 a.m. DC time. The first reports of explosions in Doha came at 8:51 a.m. And then it says, Trump knew about the strike before the missiles were launched. First, there was a discussion on the political level between Netanyahu and Trump, and afterwards, through military channels, Trump didn't say no. A second senior Israeli official said the U.S. was notified well in advance on a political level. If Trump had wanted to stop it, he could have. In practice, he didn't. So that tells you that basically the Israelis are not going ahead and allowing Trump to evade responsibility for it. So in public, they're giving Trump, a kind of public to the opportunity to do the plausible deniability. However, they're letting the media know that, yeah, absolutely, they were in on it. It's one of those things whereby you can enjoy both stories. You can enjoy the story of this claim that didn't have anything to do with us, and yet nudge nudge, wink wink, we were in on this from the start. Again, since I always talk about Yugoslavia, it does kind of reminds me of the attack on the Chinese embassy. Remember the Chinese embassy that was hit by NATO during the bombing of Belgrade? Caused a bit of an embarrassment. I mean, the Chinese weren't very happy about their embassy being bombed. And they didn't like it that three Chinese embassy personnel were killed by NATO bombs. So the United States did a mea culpa. We're very, very, very sorry. We we were using old maps. It was just an out of date old paper map. We were using a kind of A to Z from of Belgrade from I don't know 1957 or something. So sorry, we thought this was another bill. We thought this was kind of a Ministry of Defense warehouse. Turns out it was a U.S. embassy. I mean, it was a Chinese embassy. So that's the story they went with. Completely ludicrous. But then the U.S. started putting out to the media, no, of course it wasn't an accident. Of course we were targeting the Chinese embassy. What do you think? We're stupid? No, we basically we knew the Chinese embassy was being used as part of the Yugoslav government's intelligence infrastructure. They were basically using the Chinese embassy communications facilities during the war. That was one story. Another story was that they wanted to target Milosevic. Milosevic was spending his nights at the Chinese embassy. It doesn't matter. They were putting out these stories so that they get the benefit of both. They can, in public, they can say, sorry, we were using paper maps from 1957. And then they can tell the journalists, hey, we're really sophisticated. You think, really, we didn't know this was the embassy? No, we knew exactly what we were doing. We had to hit the Yugoslav intelligence infrastructure. Anyway, long story short, Cynthia, you're absolutely right. We never do find any of these things because we're dealing with people who are very good at lying, and they're masters at it. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. Robert says, is it fair to say that Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982 led to the Marine barracks bombing a year later? Well, I think in part because what happened after the Israeli after the Israeli invasion is that Israel then, with the assistance of the United States, set up this very essentially an Israeli puppet government in Beirut, and therefore this is the United States, had helped set up this government. So that meant that essentially Syria and Iran, their influence in Lebanon was now completely eliminated. And obviously, the longer that the United States stayed on in Lebanon, the more likely it was, in fact, the more it was an absolute certainty that Lebanon would become a U.S.-Israeli satellite state. This was never the plan. I mean, originally, the only reason there were the Marines were stationed in Lebanon was to help the PLO fighters evacuate Lebanon and move to Tunis. But instead, as always happens with this mission creep, the United States decided that we're going to help out Lebanon. We're going to do some nation building in Lebanon. And they stayed on. But the plan was the Israeli plan, which is to turn Lebanon into an Israeli satellite state. And once they did that, Syria was obviously very unhappy about this. Syria has always claimed, this is Lebanon and Syria were one state, and the Iranians were very unhappy about this. Essentially, it was removing the influence of the Muslim government. It was entirely, in other words, they would be ruled by the Maronite Christians in alliance with Israel. So the key was that the United States Marines were seen as the guarantors of this satellite state that was being created in Lebanon. So absolutely, that was the reason for the attack on the Marine barracks. They wanted to get the Americans out, and they wanted to reassert um, Syrian and thereby Iranian influence on Lebanon, and that did happen. I think Reagan realized, belatedly, that he had been made into a complete patsy. I mean, that this was a total fiasco. He'd been made a patsy by Israel. He had no interest at all in kind of creating a government in Lebanon. He had no interest in nation building in Lebanon. But Israel wanted to create this Israel Maronite state on its northern border. So yeah, that's exactly it. It did indeed seal the fate of those U.S. Marines. So thank you, Robert. And then Vic Shakapopoulos, good to see you. And dear George, on one of your last podcasts, okay, you argued that 9/11 hasn't changed much. You're right in pointing out that Washington followed the playbook described some years earlier in the Project for the New American Century, yes. But the event was obviously essential in convincing Americans not to resist it and accept things like the Patriot Act, which took away the most basic rights of U.S. citizens. Yeah. So 9/11 did have a huge impact on the internal American politics, and it paved the way to the implementation total surveillance state, not only in the US, but eventually around the world. It can't be ignored. The fact that these policies were planned all along doesn't change much. It just shows that rather obvious conspiracy around the event. I don't recall you expressing your opinion on 9/11. Do you believe the official stories? I am conspiratorial. I don't know what exactly happened, but that doesn't mean that anyone can convince me that bringing down three towers with two planes suddenly becomes possible. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the inexplicable things that happened on that day. Um, well, you're right about the Patriot Act, but it's one of I always think like the Patriot Act is it's always there. It's always a kind of an ongoing thing in the United States. Hey, how can we limit people's civil liberties, people's ability to express their views as much as possible? So, um, if those of us who had lived through the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 will remember the massive curtailment of civil liberties that came in after the Oklahoma City bombing. That always happens. Government seizes on some terrible event, and then brings in draconian legislation, in response. So there'd already been draconian legislation following the Oklahoma City bombing, the effective, whatever it was called, Effective Death Penalty Act. I can't remember the exact, but that was all. And I remember a number of people wrote suggesting that Oklahoma City bombing was an inside job precisely in order to bring in a draconian restriction on civil liberties. I think Gore Vidal wrote something about that. I may be wrong, but I seem to remember reading Gore Vidal doubting the official story about the Oklahoma City bombing, that it was just an excuse in order for a crackdown on civil society. And then that led to the hysteria about the militia movement. There were all these subversive groups wanting to seize the government, overthrow the government. That went on for years and years. After the Oklahoma City bombing, a hysteria about the militia movement and a plot to overthrow the government. So 9/11 and the moment it happened, you knew, well, something similar was going to happen, and of course and it absolutely did. Um, but this kind of thing, it's just an ongoing aspect of American life, whereby the law enforcement authorities acquire greater and greater powers, and surveil, spy on innumerable domestic organizations, and worse, they instigate events that they then purport to uh, squash, and then use that to send people to prison for the rest of their lives. So we had all the various Islamic plots that were actually instigated by the FBI, and then of course we had the various plots such as the Whitmer kidnapping plot. I think January the 6th was something very similar. You basically go around encouraging people to engaging in some sort of conspiracy to overthrow the government, to kill someone, kidnap someone, and lo and behold, it was all essentially cooked up by the FBI. Did it change America? No, because it was a continuation of what had been going on for years before. I mean, it was a continuation of what had happened after the Oklahoma City bombing, and a continuation, incidentally, of what the FBI was doing during the 1960s. I mean, about Contolepro, what J. Edgar Hoover said, how they were basically infiltrating. Um, I never pronounce it properly. Contelpro. I always have difficulties with that. But yeah, they were infiltrating organizations, all sorts of organizations in the 1960s, because they're all in the business of trying to overthrow the U.S. government. The FBI needs to infiltrate them, and it wasn't just organizations on the left. They did it with the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, there's always this move to crack down on civil liberties. There's always this threat from some groups or other to overthrow the government. So I didn't see that was anything very much change. Just like I didn't think that the U.S. response was in any way surprising, was in any way not what you would have expected the United States to do. They're always going to target some, uh, countries that are deemed to be a threat to U.S. security. So you go there in 2001. Um, there's the attack on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Well, you're going to have to blame it on somebody. Somebody's going to have to get clobbered. You knew that. And so it was now just a matter of deciding whom the United States would target for this. Now, the obvious targets were the jihadis, but that's not really that wasn't really satisfactory to Washington, because the jihadis were obviously on the American payroll. I mean, Bin Laden and all of the jihadis, they've been working for the U.S. government for years and years. So it was, that wasn't a satisfactory target. Well, Saddam Hussein was a nice one, and as I said before, and I know people may doubt it, if Milosevic had still been in power in Belgrade in September 11th, 2001, but he was already gone by then. There was a coup in October 2000. He was overthrown in October 2000. June the 28th, 2021, he was shipped off to the Hague. But if he hadn't been, if he was still in power in Belgrade, he absolutely would have been deemed to have taken part in the plot to hit the Twin Towers. That's the way the U.S. operates. So it's like who's the enemy of the moment? The villain du jour. For several years, it had been Milosevic. Now he was gone; he couldn't become Milosevic anymore. Even though, incidentally, during the run up to the Iraq invasion, there were many stories. I wrote about this at the time. There were many stories linking Saddam Hussein's Iraq to, yes, Serbia. Serbia was providing arms for Saddam Hussein. So yeah, it was so much so familiar. I don't think it changed anything very much. I think U.S. foreign policy was exactly the same afterwards as it was before. And then once you've done what you did, you overthrew Saddam Hussein. You pretend that you're not really interested in staying on. Hey, blah blah. You say, yeah, it was failed. And we're not going to do this ever again. And this is standard. This is what America always does. We're not going to do this. No more Vietnams. No more Iraqs. And then we do the same thing again. Same thing again. And when I say nothing much changed, Obama, he rides to power in 2008. No more stupid wars. No more Iraqs. We're not going to do that again. We're not going to fake intelligence. We're not going to be taken in by fake stories in order to justify attacking other countries. And then lo and behold, that same Barack Obama uses fake intelligence to attack Libya, just as he went on to use fake intelligence to discredit his successor, Trump. So that's why I'm just saying that I don't think very much changed as a result. In terms of what happened on that day, I don't know. At the time, I took a little bit of an interest because I didn't think that the story made a great deal of sense. I mean, the part that interested me in when I looked at 9/11 was why, not so much about the towers themselves, which I'm not an engineer, so I can't really judge whether towers can come down like that or not. So I don't want to get into that. But I thought it was odd that they hijack a plane and they have quite a lot of information, quite a lot of time from the moment they find out that the plane has been hijacked to the time that the plane then is flown into the buildings. Quite a lot of time had elapsed. Why when there was no attempt to apprehend the plane? Why weren't fighter jets scrambled in the air to try to apprehend these airliners as they crashed into the World Trade Center? I mean, there was a lot of time. A lot of time is lost because they knew air traffic control knew quite early on that they had been hijacked. So given that they'd been hijacked, why weren't aircraft scrambled immediately to try to apprehend the planes? So that's the part that I found interesting. And then I didn't really think it was very plausible that these would-be pilots, the hijackers, would know how to maneuver passenger airliners to their target. They have to fly through Manhattan. Not an easy task with all the tall buildings of Manhattan, to be able to fly through at a very low altitude through Manhattan, not hit any of the tall buildings, and go straight into the World Trade Center, your desired target. How could they do it? These people, they've taken some classes. So what? I could take some classes on flying a plane. I don't think I'd be able to fly a passenger airliner into the World Trade Center. I think that takes a little bit of skill to do. I don't think a few classes um, is going to do the job. So I wondered about the time. That at the time, it didn't. The official story didn't really make a great deal of sense. And so I never got into the whole thing about the buildings. Would they come crashing down or they wouldn't crashing down? But I thought the stories about why no attempt was made to apprehend the airliners baffled me. I never heard a good explanation why that didn't happen, and I never heard a good explanation as to how these idiots could have just acquired these amazing piloting skills to fly the planes into the World Trade Center. That just didn't make any sense to me. But I never got any very far with it, so I just didn't really pursue it. But you know, I wish all the best to those who want to pursue it. I don't know if it can be done. Even if someday they're going to open up yet another inquiry, like they had another inquiry into the Kennedy assassinations. But I'm not sure anything much more will ever be found out. Anyway, so anyway, thanks so much for the question, and then Robert, thank you so much, Robert. It says, I just learned that the term melting pot comes from the title of Israel Zangwill's 1908 play. I didn't know that. Given the anti German backlash a decade later, especially the 1917 Bisbee, Arizona deportation, was Zangwill's vision of America more a progressive hope than a reality? Well, it's a very interesting notion, because the Americans at the time were not at all wedded to the idea of a melting pot. In fact, they were rather opposed to the melting pot. I mean, we're talking about a kind of waspy America that was less than enthused about the wave of mass immigration in the late 19th century and early 20th century. They thought this was a terrible idea, bringing in essentially, low-level poor people from Europe, Italians, Irish, Jews, and so it was going to change the nature of the country. And so the idea of a melting pot wasn't such a great idea. I mean, they didn't want to melt. I think sort of the white Anglo-Saxon America didn't exactly want to meld in with the Irish and the Italians and the Jews. And then they adopted very harshly restrictive immigration policy. And the goal was, we don't want to change America. We kind of like America as it was. Not a great idea, bringing in people who are just, are going to lower the tone of the place, as they thought that these immigrants had lowered the tone of America. And if they'd had their way, that would have continued. I mean, it just suddenly changed. After 40 years, it suddenly changed with the the Kennedy's immigration bill of 1965, and then of course America did massively change. So I'm not sure that that old waspy America ever really embraced the idea of the melting pot. In fact, they didn't. And I remember. What was it? There was a guy. What was the name of that? There was a book written in I guess it was the early '60s. By those kind of early neocon sociologists, Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Nathan Glazer. It was called, I think, Beyond the Melting Pot. And they seem to express some skepticism that America was indeed a melting pot. They didn't. I mean, it's a long time ago since I read the book, but they didn't think that America actually was a melting pot. That actually people retain their own ethnic and cultural identities, and I think they thought that that was a good idea, that they should retain their own ethnic identity. But I mean, I would think a kind of waspy the America, the sort of the say the America of I don't know, the James Angleton. They said, okay, we've got these people. We didn't really want them. Now we've got them. Well, we better turn them into wasps. They should just become like us. They become wasps. We have them. We got to turn them into wasps, and that's it. So they wouldn't really like the idea that people retaining their ethnic and cultural identity. That we should make them wasps. They'll be inferior wasps, but wasps nonetheless. But anyway, I didn't know that the word melting pot from that. So I'm not a huge fan of melting pots. I mean, I think countries should try to retain their identities, and I do think that the old America was a lot better than the new America. Whatever the problems of the old America, but I think it was better than the new America. Anyway, thank you, Robert, and then Dr. Nostrand says, why should the U.S. care about Hamas beyond the extent that they might threaten U.S. military presence in the area? I mean, if we're talking about the issue of why they survived, which is very unusual. I mean, the Hamas are usually just sitting ducks in these attacks. Maybe Trump didn't fancy getting humiliated by Netanyahu again. He he knew that they were discussing Trump's own peace plan, so he wanted to, I mean, it wouldn't look good that they would have their brains blown out as they were talking about Trump's plan, and so that's why that's just a theory. I'm not sure, but that's how that somehow Trump managed to save face by the fact that these would-be negotiators at least survived. So that may be a reason why the U.S. decided we'll make sure that Israel doesn't kill them. And Dr. Nostrand says, okay, Israel made the decision, but Mossad told the U.S. shortly before the attack, so the U.S. would not respond to the attack. Well, if that story in Axios is correct, then there was obviously time to call off the attack. So that's one thing. But it's possible that what had happened was just as I was saying, the time that they had between the moment that Netanyahu informed Trump and the landing of the bombs, that was enough time to make sure at least that the Hamas leaders were saved, that their lives were spared. Then they may have used that time then just to tell them, hey, get out of the way, get your phones out of the vicinity. So that's what is a possibility that was used. So it was a kind of a Trumpian kind of compromise. He didn't tell Netanyahu to call off the attack, but he may have given a warning to Hamas. Hey, get rid of your phones. Anyway, Dr. Nostrand says, does anyone really believe that President Trump and President Obama were sufficiently on call to have done much of anything about preemptive Israeli strikes? Maybe Trump ignored or simply did not attend a daily intelligence briefing. No, Trump, if he wants to, he can stop something. If he wants to do it. He stopped the Israeli attack on Iran after the ceasefire supposedly went into effect in June. He stopped it. He told Netanyahu to knock it off. So yeah, that was so he does it. Anyway, it's too all right. Anyway, then the doctor goes on. Previously hijacked planes have simply been flown to places like Havana. However, there are unusual features of the hijacking. As for flying the plane, The hijackings had been attending pilot school, but flying planes to New York City could be difficult. That said, the World Trade Center is located in the southern end of Manhattan and are relatively close to the ocean. Also, they were, when built, exceptionally tall. Yeah, it's still bloody difficult to get there. And I think they were flying through Manhattan. You know, I don't think a few classes in piloting school is gonna teach you how to fly a passenger aircraft through Manhattan. I just don't think that that's the case. I mean, it's like, I mean, remember what happened to John Kennedy? He took a lot more classes than that. He took many classes in piloting, and that still wasn't enough for him to avoid crashing a much smaller plane. So you're talking about, just flying a passenger airliner into a building. Very difficult to do. Anyway, all right. So, um, and then yeah. So anyway, my time is up. Thank you, everybody who joined me. Thank you, everybody who contributed. A lot of really interesting questions, very stimulating questions. Thank you of all to everyone who managed to put something into the dog's tip jar, because the dogs will soon be waking up. First thing they do when they wake up, check up on the tip jar, and then next thing is to curse me out, and for my retarded nature. And but that's, I'm gonna have to deal with that tomorrow. Thank you for today, and we will be back on Thursday for another live stream. I hope you'll join me. Until then, all the best. Good night. Bye bye.